The morning air carried a quiet chill as Ava Morgan stepped out of the sleek black town car that pulled up in front of Dillard and Rowe Global, a towering glass-walled structure that gleamed with artificial pride and corporate self, its lobby bustling with sharply dressed professionals who barely glanced up from their phones as she approached the entrance in a modest navy blue dress, her coiled natural hair pinned into a low bun, and a soft leather folder tucked under her eyes scanning the facade with the kind of gaze that only came from someone who owned the building, not just admired it. Yet no one inside knew that the woman who stepped in quietly that morning was not a visitor, not a job applicant, not a vendor dropping off paperwork, but the newly appointed CEO of the holding company that had just acquired the controlling interest in Dillard and Rowe as of 7 a.m. that very day. A silent maneuver executed with precision, privacy, and a signature that bore Ava's name in bold ink. But when she stepped up to the receptionist desk, a thin, smirking blonde with a headset half hanging from her ear, flipping lazily through an Instagram reel on her phone, barely looked up and, in a tone soaked in thinly veiled contempt, said, "You lost or something. Deliveries are through the side entrance," before returning her attention to a screen. And when Ava calmly said she had a meeting scheduled on the 21st floor and asked for her visitor badge, the receptionist rolled her eyes, sneered, and, without even checking the schedule, muttered, "Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England, get lost, lady. This isn't a walk-in clinic," and turned away as if Ava no longer existed, her hand dismissively waving her off as if swatting a fly. What the receptionist didn't know, what no one in that building knew yet, was that Ava Morgan was not just here for a meeting. She owned this company now. She owned the building, the contracts, the payroll, the board's secrets, the real estate, the legal rights, the intellectual property. And in that instant, Ava made no scene, no protest, simply turned on her heels and walked out, her strides slow and deliberate, stepping back into the waiting car and instructing her assistant via a single text, "Activate phase 2, effective immediately." And while the receptionist laughed with a co-worker about another lost girl with an attitude, inside that town car Ava's entire legal team, compliance officers, and IT lockdown staff were already being dispatched remotely, and in 5 minutes the security servers would begin denying access to every C-level executive except one name, Ava Morgan. As the town car rolled away from the front of Dillard and Rowe Global, Ava Morgan sat in its leather interior with the grace of a queen who had already won the war before a single soldier took the field. Her fingers laced over her lap, eyes calm, and voice level as she spoke into a Bluetooth headset, issuing a cascade of commands that triggered a carefully laid plan to years in the making. A quiet vengeance born not of anger but of righteous purpose and earned power, because Ava that hadn't stumbled into this moment by accident. No, she had watched this company from a distance for years, ever since her own startup had been mocked by one of Dillard and Rowe's former partners who told her they don't do business with affirmative action experiments. And while they laughed behind boardroom doors, she built smarter, stronger, and with the quiet fire of a woman who had learned that dignity was a weapon more powerful than any fury. And now, as her private acquisition firm, Morgan Equity Strategies, had bought up every share that mattered, every executive who had whispered her name with doubt would learn that the shadow they ignored had now become the storm they couldn't stop. And so within minutes of her departure, the first wave hit. IT systems across the 21st floor began flashing red alerts. Executive emails were disabled, access to confidential documents revoked, and an alert went out from Ava's legal chief notifying every senior leader that an emergency board meeting had been convened under the terms of the buyout contract. Effective immediately, attendance mandatory or considered resignation. And while chaos erupted upstairs, Ava's driver circled the block slowly, waiting for her signal, and she reflected on the woman behind the desk, the one who so casually dismissed her not just as a person, but as a black woman with quiet poise and no visible title, and how the reception area, so sleek with its marble counter and faux smile decor, had become a symbol of everything wrong with corporate culture, how too many companies protected privilege, polished exclusion, and taught gatekeepers to judge worth by skin tone, voice, or fashion choice, and how that receptionist wasn't the real enemy, just a foot soldier in a system that believed power had a color, that leadership had a gender, that wealth wore tailored suits and never walked in with calm eyes and natural curls. So Ava didn't blame her, but she would teach her, because sometimes lessons don't come in lectures, but in the silence that falls when the whole machine halts. And back inside the building, that machine was cracking. Security couldn't access Ava's name in the visitor system because she'd deliberately kept it off the books. The receptionist still laughed with a coworker about some angry delivery chick when HR burst into the lobby, panic all over their faces as they whispered frantically into headsets. And then came the ripple every department lead called. Upstairs, the legal team's inboxes flooded with contract overrides, and then a single email landed in every inbox across the company from the chair of the Dillard and Rowe board. Subject line: effective ownership transfer, Morgan Equity, with a one-line announcement beneath: as of 7 a.m. Ava Morgan is the acting CEO of Dillard and Rowe Global. All directives will come from her office. Immediate compliance required. And as that email set fire to every quiet conversation and stunned gasp in the offices above, Ava's town car rolled back around, pulling up to the curb once more with calm confidence as she stepped out. Folder, still under her arm, face expressionless, eyes forward as the front door swung open for her, not by the receptionist, but by the building's private head of security, who had been instructed to escort her directly to the executive suite. And this time no one stopped her. No one asked her to wait. No one dared. Because Power had walked in not with a raised voice or a threat, but with authority earned in silence. And at the very center of it all, the receptionist sat frozen at her desk, jaw slack, eyes wide, mouth parted in disbelief as Ava passed by, not even sparing her a glance. Because the lesson had begun and Ava wasn't here for revenge. She was here for reckoning. As Ava Morgan ascended in the private elevator reserved for top-tier executives, now hers by right and acquisition, the hum of the building's panic rippled upward like a rising tide, her presence already reshaping every corridor she'd never stepped foot in before, and yet everyone now whispered her name with a mixture of disbelief, awe, and quiet fear, because in this glass and steel world where black women were too often told to wait their turn, to dress smaller, to speak softer, to prove they belonged over and over again, Ava had stepped straight into the throne room without permission, without apology, and with the full legal might of a buyout behind her. So when the elevator doors slid open to the 21st floor, the silence that greeted her wasn't the respectful hush of welcome, but the breathless stillness of people trying to understand how they'd misread Power so completely. And as she strode past the executive assistants who rose from their desks instinctively, not one dared ask her name, for they'd seen the memo now, seen the email from the board, seen the names that had been removed from the internal directory in real time, CEO, CFO, call wiped, all replaced with a single one, Morgan, Ava, Chief Executive Officer. And still, she said nothing as she walked into the corner office that had belonged to Gerald Rowe just yesterday, now empty, the mahogany desk still warm with the arrogance he'd left behind when he stormed out to demand answers from his board, not knowing those very board members had already turned to Ava when their stock value had dropped and their investors panicked, and Ava's firm offered a full bailout and restructure plan so airtight that refusing it would have meant ruin. So, while Gerald seethed somewhere in his estate, Ava stood in his chair, looking out over the city skyline like a woman who had finally opened the doors that had been locked to her for a generation. Not just for her, but for every woman like her, who'd ever been told she didn't look the part, didn't sound the part, didn't belong in the rooms where decisions were made. And as she turned to face the group now summoned before her, their executives, the HR head, the internal counsel, and yes, the very receptionist who had told her to get lost, now standing pale and nervous at the back of the room with wide eyes and trembling hands, Va began to speak, and the room held its breath, because her voice didn't rise with fury or vengeance, but settled into them like truth forged in iron. I was told to get lost this morning, she began, her tone calm but laced with steel, in a building I now own, by a company I now lead, by a culture I will now change from the foundation up. And every person there felt the weight of those words, not as threats, but as prophesied, because Ava wasn't just here to fire people, she was here to dismantle the old order, brick by exclusionary brick. And as she laid out her vision, mandatory day training for all departments, leadership audits across all levels, review and overhaul of hiring and promotion practices, and the creation of a diversity oversight board chaired by herself, there were nods. There were stares. There were even a few scoffs quickly swallowed. But what no one missed was the clarity in her presence, the unapologetic force of a woman who had not come to beg for inclusion, but to demand accountability. And when she finally turned her gaze to the receptionist, Ava didn't gloat, didn't mock, simply asked, "What's your name?" And when the woman stammered, Ty Tracy, Ava nodded once and said, "You'll be receiving training as part of our new guest protocol initiative. If you complete it with excellence, your role will continue. If not, it won't. Fair." And Tracy, who had never imagined her own behavior would be under a microscope, nodded wordlessly. And that was that because Ava didn't believe in destroying people unless they chose not to grow. But she absolutely believed in standards. And Tracy now knew the standard had changed forever. And for the next hour, Ava issued directives, reassigned power, demoted egos, and elevated overlooked talenture, asked the quietest person in the room a question about operations. And when she got a smart, data-backed answer, she made him interim director on the spot. She opened the doors that had been bolted shut, not just for herself, but for the ones like her still knocking, still waiting, still hoping. And when the meeting ended and people filed out with new realities orbiting their heads like moons pulled into Ava's gravitational force, the receptionist didn't return to her desk. Not right away. She stood for a long time in the hallway, staring down at the woman she'd tried to dismiss, realizing too late that the world had changed in a matter of minutes, not just for Ava, but for her, for everyone. Because Ava didn't just walk in and take over, she reset the very rules of how power would now move through that building, through that industry, through the broken culture that had allowed arrogance to wear a suit while humility was asked to wait in the lobby. And this, Ava thought quietly as she looked out the window again, was only the beginning. The following weeks unfolded like a seismic shift masked in professionalism. As Ava Morgan embedded herself into every level of the company she now controlled, not as a distant figurehead hiding behind glass doors or executive memos, but as a leader who moved through hallways with quiet intent, listening more than speaking, watching the way people interacted when they thought no one important was paying attention, and steadily replacing the culture of arrogance and exclusion with one of accountability, purpose, and measured power. And it didn't take long for word to spread beyond Dillard and Rosewall's industry blogs ran breathless stories about the hostile takeover by the unknown black CEO. Stock analysts buzzed about Morgan Equity's precision in swallowing a floundering corporate giant, but no one outside the building truly understood what Ava was doing on the inside. She wasn't just rebranding, she was rebuilding. And each decision she made sent ripples through a workforce that had never known this kind of clarity from the top. She launched an internal audit of salaries and promotions, exposing decades of pay disparity that had quietly suffocated talented women and people of color. And when she corrected it with back pay and publicly announced a new equity structure, jaws dropped. She walked into the marketing department unannounced, reviewed a pitch deck herself. And when she discovered that a junior black strategist had developed the concept alone while her white supervisor took credit, Ava promoted the strategist on the spot and reassigned the supervisor to training review. She transformed HR from a department of silence into one of action, empowering whistleblowers and confidential reporting, installing third-party monitors and opening the doors to those previously pushed out. And through it all, she remained calm, deliberate, unflinching, the kind of powerful that didn't raise its voice because it didn't need to. Because when Ava spoke, systems responded, rooms adjusted, people straightened their backs and remembered they were in the presence of someone who had once been underestimated, disrespected, and dismissed, someone who had risen not in spite of it, but because of it. And yes, she saw Tracy again, the receptionist, who now arrived early, who now greeted every visitor with professionalism so crisp it drew compliments from clients who never knew the backstory. And though Ava never dwelt on that first encounter, she did offer a quiet moment one day in the lobby. A brief nod of acknowledgement as Tracy handed her a guest badge for someone Ava had invited herself. A young black woman fresh out of college with wide eyes and a nervous smile, shadowing Ava, as part of a new mentorship initiative Ava had created for first-gen professionals, because this was the legacy Ava intended to leave behind, not just power reclaimed, but opportunity restructured, doors reopened, and bridges built where walls had once been. And as the company slowly transformed, shedding its old skin, it wasn't just the board or the stockholders or the competitors who noticed. It was the janitors who finally had medical benefits, the interns who were offered paid stipends, the mailroom clerk who got his GED on company time, the single mom in accounting who was promoted for the first time in 8 years. All of them began to feel it. A quiet revolution was blooming inside a place that had once thrived on hierarchy and image, now reshaped by a leader who understood that power wasn't about corner offices or nameplates, but about how you showed up when nobody expected you to, about how you moved when others told you to wait, and most of all, how you gave others the space to rise behind you. And in the end, the world didn't explode with some grand press conference or viral video, but with something stronger, an undeniable shift in how people carried themselves when they walked into the building Ava now ran. A company that once dismissed a black woman at the door now transformed by one at the helm. And for Ava, that was enough. Not vengeance, not spectacle, just the satisfying truth that the same place that told her to get lost now thrived because she had returned, taken her seat, and made it hers forever.